If you can hear the sound of my voice, you're listening to the Paperback Warrior Podcast.
Thank you for joining us for the Paperback Warrior Podcast. We're a vintage fiction discussion and a review show touching on the world of 20th century crime fiction, action-adventure, western, and espionage. Our website, paperbackwarrior.com, showcases book reviews every day and features articles about our favorite authors and series titles. Let me introduce Tom, my co-host, who's going to tell us about today's episode.
Thanks, Eric. Today I'm going to be doing a feature on a vintage crime fiction author you should know about named Bruno Fischer. In the body of that, I'm going to give you some capsule reviews of some of Fischer's greatest hits, and you can weigh in because you just finished reading a book by him called So Wicked My Love by the author, and I have no idea whether you liked it or not. For today's book reviews, you're going to tell us about a balls-out team adventure book you read called Crime Commandos by Peter Cave. There's a lot to unpack in this episode, so we'll see if there's time for me to do a second review, but you're going to hear a lot about Bruno Fischer's books and kind of a reading guide as far as where to go. Now, before we get into our feature, Eric, you wanted to touch on some different categories of crime fiction and what we mean when we talk about hard-boiled versus noir.
Yes, exactly. So in recent discussions on the Facebook group pages, someone brought up, I think it was crime noir versus hard-boiled. I think that was the name of the discussion. Crime noir versus hard-boiled. I've always lumped the two subgenres together, but maybe that's a little presumptuous on my part. Tom, I'd like you to explain what do we really mean by the term noir?
Well, no, technically, noir is a French word that literally just means black. It was originally used in this context by a French film critic in 1946 to describe a certain type of dark film style. The term quickly spread and became overused, in my opinion, as a descriptor for dark, pessimistic, and foreboding corner of crime fiction as well. Otto Penzler makes the point that noir is kind of like pornography, difficult to describe, but you know it when you see it. A useful definition for noir fiction that I once heard, and I looked forever to try to find who said this. I think it was Ed Gorman, but if I'm misquoting someone else, I really apologize, is that noir fiction is about amateurs thrown into criminal situations. They're not private detectives, they're not police, but they're normal people, almost always men, who are thrust into a world of criminality because they're seduced by greed or lust or both. The femme fatale is a staple of noir fiction, whereas an otherwise honest man is convinced or manipulated by a scheming dame that murdering someone will help get the money and the girl. Inevitably, in these stories, the guy should be careful what he wishes for. I distinguish this from private eye fiction or police procedural fiction in which the main character is a professional hero trying to solve a crime. I also distinguish this from anti-hero books like Richard Stark, his Parker books, his professional heist guy, or Quarry books from Max Allan Collins. These are all examples of hard-boiled crime because they deal with hard-to-edge professionals in a violent criminal world, but I don't think anyone would describe the Parker books or the Quarry books as being noir novels. In the same breath, I would also argue that there's zero upside of being a pedantic a-hole when talking about whether something qualifies as noir or hard-boiled fiction. There's just a lot of gray areas, and at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. There's some great compilations of short stories and novellas dealing with noir fiction. I got a big stack of them here if you ever want to borrow one or look at them. There's one called A Century of Noir, edited by Mickey Spillane and Max Allan Collins. The Best Noir of the Century, edited by James Elroy and Otto Penzler. And there's a ton of regional short story collections that I've never really dug into, like Alabama Noir, Florida Noir, New Orleans Noir, Bombay Noir, Bangkok Noir. And there's some great nonfiction works about the genre. A really good one is The Big Book of Noir, edited by Ed Gorman, Lee Server, and Martin Greenberg. Hard-Boiled Noir and Gold Medals is a great collection of essays from Starkhouse, all written by a guy named Rick Olerman.
Yeah, I think since we've been talking about it on here, and I think thanks for that really well-defined definition, but I think like what you say, I'm just going to consider the average person caught up in a crime as crime noir, and it's literally the average character placed into an extraordinary circumstance. And I think a good example of that, maybe a book that I read here recently, Gil Brewer's The Vengeful Virgin, And it was about this average blue-collar TV repairman who falls for this really sexy, hot girl who convinces him to kill this old man so she can inherit his money. So that's kind of the definition of crime noir, in my opinion. The idea of hard-boiled crime seems pretty easy. Like you said, it's just the professional involved in a crime-ridden story. I guess any private eye or police procedural could fit into that sort of broad idea of hard-boiled crime, right?
Yeah, I think they need to have an air of violence and menace about them. Like Miss Marple by Agatha Christie. No one would accuse her of being hard-boiled crime or noir. Those are kind of cozy mysteries. So I imagine there's very kind of light and fluffy private eyes floating around there in the genre. But, kind of the blood on the knuckles, Mickey Spillane, guys who are sort of imitating Mickey Spillane, the Continental Op, or Philip Marlowe. I think all those guys would fall into basic hard-boiled crime.
Okay.
And if not noir, I mean, who knows?
Yeah. Well, I just finished a novel that I think fits into the first category. I think it's crime noir, and it ties into your Bruno Fischer feature. So why don't you kick things off with talking about Bruno Fischer?
Sure. Bruno Fischer is one of my favorite crime fiction authors, and so what I want to do is talk about his life, because it's sort of unusual and somewhat remarkable, and then we'll circle back and discuss the most important books for you, the listener, to explore. Bruno Fischer was born in Berlin, Germany in 1908. He was the son of a grocer. He immigrated to the USA in 1913 when he was 5 years old. He died in 1992 while in Mexico. For reasons I'll discuss later, I've always thought of Bruno as being a New Yorker. He went to high school on Long Island. Another thing to understand about Bruno, and don't tune out when you hear this, is that he was a socialist. After graduating from the Rand School of Social Sciences, a school that was established by the American Socialist Party. Before you judge Bruno too harshly, let's remember that we're talking about the pre-World War II era. Again, you and I grew up in the heart of the Cold War, Eric, in the 70s and 80s when we're hiding under our desks, waiting for nuclear bombs to be dropped. And I always associated the people who wanted to kill us as being communists and socialists, the Soviet Union. But this is before the Soviet communism. This is before the collapse of Venezuela, before Sweden and Denmark began experimenting with socialist policies. In the 1930s, socialism was just another idea for an economic system. And again, we're also talking about a time during the Great Depression where, Roosevelt's New Deal had a lot of tendencies with socialism, basically. There's nothing particularly shameful or un-American about gravitating to this idea back then. And again, I think the Great Depression affected people in ways that I can't even begin to understand. So you can imagine why people like Bruno Fischer had a good reason to be skeptical about unrestrained capitalism and might search for what he thought was a better way. So after college, he gets a job as a sports and police reporter for the Long Island Daily Press between 1929 and 1931. He went on to edit and write left-leaning socialist publications, The Labor Voice, Socialist Call, Modern Monthly. He was also active in a Jewish socialist fraternity called the Workmen's Circle. He ran for a seat on New York's 14th District, and he also ran for the New York State Senate as the Socialist Party candidate in 1936 and 1938, and he lost both times. Why do his politics and his economics matter? Because understanding that Bruno is a socialist is interesting when you read his short stories and paperback original crime novels in the 1950s, because there's often a theme running through them about how corporations will screw someone over, or about how a windfall of money in someone's life ends up bringing trouble and misery as opposed to happiness and contentment. So it's kind of interesting if you can see him, read his books through that lens. So his fiction writing career actually started in the 1930s when he sold his first sale to a pulp magazine called Dime Mystery in November 1936. The story was called The Cat Woman. It was about a woman trapped in an elevator with a cat. The woman is convinced that the cat is really a witch. And so, Eric, trivia time here. How much do you think Bruno Fischer was paid for his first story in 1936?
$25.
Higher.
Higher?
Yeah.
All right.
These pulps sold a bazillion
okay.
copies.
$50.
60. He made $60 for his first story, which is a lot of money in 1936, right? So his next story was 10,000 words long and paid $125. So this is good money. He found a way to make a living. His expertise were creepy stories in what they called the weird menace pulps, also known as the shudder pulps, which became a subgenre unto itself in 1933 and had magazines such as Dime Mystery, Terror Tales, and Horror Stories that were devoted to weird menace stories. Eric, you know a thing or two about weird menace stories. What can you tell us about the formula of those stories?
Well, I've got this really cool 1975 book in my collection called The Shudder Pulps, A History of the Weird Menace Magazine of the 1930s by a guy named Robert Kenneth Jones. Unfortunately, due to being Paperback Warrior's marketing representative and chief graphic designer, I don't have time to read stuff like that. So my guess is that I guess it just involves the supernatural?
Yeah, well, no, it's a little more than that. The Vintage Library website does a really nice job of describing the formula of a weird menace story. Usually some horrible, devilish, and to some degree supernatural being is threatening the well-being of everyone in the story. But in most cases, it causes a great deal of torture and sadistic attacks on women. The pulp covers of weird menace stories usually capture the essence of the torture and show the girls in various stages of torture and nudity. Our hero of the story, usually after his girlfriend has been taken hostage, must now confront the evil villain. And again, he may think this person has supernatural powers or it's some kind of supernatural entity. Anyway, after saving the day, our hero then explains how the devilish villain is only human and was using the latest high-tech science to scare the victims so he may gain their worldly possessions. This formula sounds very familiar to me because it was used in a childhood cartoon that you and I enjoyed.
Yeah, right.
Do you know which one?
Scooby-Dooby-Doo.
Scooby-Doo, right? It would have worked if it weren't for you meddling kids, right? There were no actual ghosts or goblins in Scooby-Doo. It was usually just some escaped convict who was trying to scare them off by pretending to be ghosts.
Right.
Scooby-Doo was the consummate weird menace story. As an aside, in 2005, friend of the show James Reasoner edited 2 compilations of weird menace stories written by contemporary authors in that pulp style. It's available on Amazon now. So if you search for Weird Menace and James Reasoner, you'll find those, and they're a lot of fun. The stories are by Reasoner. Bill Kreider wrote a couple. Mel Odom, who's still around, contributed to those as well. Anyway, so Bruno Fischer wrote most of his weird menace stories under the pseudonym of Russell Gray. This was a name he also used for socialist newspaper articles when he had 2 articles written by him in the same publication, because it looks bad to have all the articles written by the same dude. He also used the name Harrison Storm for pulp stories. Understanding that this is how Bruno got his start is helpful when you read his crime fiction of the 1950s and beyond. His weird menace stories had really salacious titles, typical of the era, like Fresh Fiancés for the Devil's Daughter, Daughters of Lusting Torment, Lovely Ladies for the Butcher, Girls Enslaved in Glass. You get the idea.
I like that one.
The stories contain painstaking amount of details describing the torture of the female captives that they had to endure. Large breasts being melted away with scalding irons. Really unpleasant stuff. Way beyond what Scooby-Doo ever offered us. The demand for that kind of material back then was high, and no actual women were disfigured in the creation of these stories. But in 1939, Bruno ended up publishing his first novel, a hardcover mystery called So Much Blood, and he moved to the place where all great authors wind up. Where is that?
Florida.
Yes, Florida. Quite suddenly in the 1940s, the market for weird menace horror stories dried up overnight, and the magazines folded all at once. So Bruno had all these unfinished weird menace stories that were sent back to him, and he focused his energies on writing crime fiction stories, still for the pulps. He wrote short stories for the pulps in a subgenre known as defective detectives. Eric, what do you think a defective detective is?
Yeah, there's a whole subgenre out of these. It's like an eye patch detective, something like that, right?
Yeah, eye patch.
Some kind of physical flaw.
Yeah, these are detectives who had distinctive physical flaws, like missing a limb or missing an eye. Again, we were just talking about this the other week, about how many detectives in 20th century seem to have some kind of deformity or missing limb. I think this was an outgrowth of the defective detective. I think of the Dan Fortune books by Michael Collins or the Mongo series by George C. Chesbrough. It was probably just an outgrowth of that tradition. Anyway, Bruno wrote his defective detective novels. It feels so awful saying the word defective detective about somebody who has a physical ailment. And he wrote them under his Russell Gray pseudonym. He had two recurring characters, one named Calvin Kane and the other name, I think it was Ben Bryn, who were both severely deformed, crab-like men
Gee whiz.
solving crimes. He hates to laugh. I guess they're fictional characters. We're not making fun of them. It's just crazy that there's this giant market. Like, you know what? I like a mystery, but I only like it if someone is so deformed they have to crawl on the ground like a crab. So Bruno was selling mystery and crime novels to some of the best publications in the era. He started selling to Black Mask magazine, where authors including Dashiell Hammett were making a name for himself. There was this productive period of Bruno Mars's career where he had several hundred stories published. He wrote 2 million words of published work between 1937 and 1941.
Astounding.
So his family moves away from Florida and back to Long Island in the early 1950s. And the pulps died off pretty much altogether in the 1940s. In the 50s, Bruno was selling short stories, his bread and butter for the 30s and 40s, but he was selling them to crime fiction digests, like Manhunt magazine, Mike Shane's Mystery magazine. In the mid-40s, Bruno launched a private eye series of his own, starring a character named Ben Helm, Helm, no relation to Matt Helm that I'm aware of. I think the series was published by Lion Books and maybe Dell. I haven't read any of the Ben Helm books. My impression is that they aren't regarded as his best work. The series ran from 1945 to 1955 for, I think, 8 books. The best-known books of the series are The Restless Hands from 1949 and Stripped for Murder from 1951. That one was also published as The Paper Circle. Now, the best authors of that era, including Bruno Fischer, transitioned to the paperback originals of the 1950s, with Fawcett Gold Medal being the top of the heap for publishers. And Bruno's best stuff, I believe, were his standalone novels, which were not filled with much graphic violence. Nobody was attacking breasts with irons in those. He seemed to have got that out of his system during the Weird Menace era. He didn't really write particularly gory books. He described his books as being about, listen to this, ordinary people in extraordinary situations. What does that description sound like to you, Eric?
That's the very definition of crime-noir.
Exactly. And so I think he was, you could argue he was one of the, a crime noir author of the 1950s. Anyway, at the urging of an author by the name of John D. MacDonald, the publication of Bruno's most successful novel, The House of Flesh, happened in 1950 with Fawcett Gold Medal. It was Fawcett Gold Medal's 123rd book. It sold 1.8 million copies, and it made Bruno a pretty big name of his era. His only novel released under a pseudonym was The Lustful Ape, which was released by Lion Books under the name of Russell Gray in 1950, and later by Fawcett Gold Medal under Bruno's own name. It was one of the few reprints that issued by Fawcett Gold Medal because they spent a lot of time bragging about their original novels and not reprints, but they felt strong enough about The Lustful Ape to do that. I actually have a copy. I've not read it, and it's still in print to this day. He wrote the book in 18 days, and it's supposed to be very good. Between 1950 and 1960, Bruno wrote 11 paperback original novels, and his Ben Helm books and earlier works were also reprinted as paperbacks, and publishers sold about 10 million copies of all of his work in that era. His books were translated into 12 languages. So in the 1960s, he wrote a book called The Girl Between in 1960, and then he suffered from writer's block really badly. And he took a job as the executive editor for a paperback publisher called Macmillan's Collier's Book, and then education editor for a textbook company called Arco Publishing Company. He had no further novels published in the 1960s, but he continued to have some short stories appearing in the digests. So 1970 rolls around, and he writes one erotic novel called Domination in 1970 under the pseudonym of Jason K. Storm, published by Olympia Ophelia Press. In 1970, he wrote his final novel, The Evil Days, which I read and reviewed on Paperback Warrior. I'll summarize the review later. And I don't know if the book was a hit or not, but it was a book club selection, so there's tons and tons of cheap, glued-together hardcovers still out there. The book is definitely worth reading. It was cool to read a 1950s-style Fawcett Gold Medal-type paperback set in the early 1970s. So Bruno ended his career on a high note. After the publication of The Evil Days, Bruno retired to spend his summers in a socialist cooperative community in Putnam County, New York, called the Three Arrows Cooperative Society. His winters were spent in one of those Mexican communities where Americans often retire to make their fixed incomes last longer. The town was called San Miguel de Allende. And Bruno used to give lectures there to expatriate community of Americans who retired down there, and he would talk about his life as a mystery writer. In total, he wrote over 300 published short stories and 25 novels. He lapsed into blindness later in his later years, and he died on one of his Mexican winters in 1992.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's his life. Let's talk about some of his books, because I think that's really what our listeners care the most about. You just read your first Bruno Fischer book recently. It was So Wicked My Love from 1954. I think there was a shortened version of that book called Coney Island Incident, appeared in Manhunt magazine in November 1953. What did you think of your first Bruno Fischer experience?
Well, I have to say I really enjoyed his writing. I enjoyed this book. So Wicked My Love is starring this guy named Ray. And when we first meet him, he's this dejected, emotional wreck, and he's just laying on Coney Island's sandy beach. His girlfriend, Florence, rejected his marriage proposal and the ring, of course, the night before. So she explained to Ray that she's still in love with this other guy. So Ray's pondering his life post-Florence, and he spots this woman that he once knew walking along the shore. Ray reintroduces himself to this beautiful vixen, and her name is Cherry. And by doing so, he almost immediately becomes an accomplice in armed robbery and murder. Wicked love indeed. But after reading a brief newspaper headline about an armed car robbery, a mysterious woman, and a band of criminals, Ray's one night out with Cherry proves to be a cornucopia of dark discoveries. He learns that Cherry has a car trunk filled with stolen cash, and she's got these 3 violent men on her trail. Ray gives Cherry the engagement ring he bought Florence, and the two decide that they're going to flee with the money together. But after a deadly, violent encounter with 2 of the 3 guys, Ray drops the money at this abandoned farmhouse, and he anonymously calls the police to just pick it up. Ray then reconvenes with Florence, and the 2 become married and live happily ever after. But considering all of these riveting events happen in the book's opening pages, we quickly sense that Bruno Fischer has a lot more intrigue, suspense, and violence left to explore. Ray's lustful encounters with Cherry aren't explicit, but they're an enticing invitation to readers to take the journey with these ill-fated lovers. As Ray's very average life becomes more complicated, readers can foresee the impending doom in Fischer's narrative. Again, by its very definition, the idea of this average blue-collar man being trapped in a web of murder, robbery, and blinding lust is crime noir in its most rudimentary form. It's also the same ritualistic formula utilized by a guy like Fischer to mesmerize readers and fans like you and I. From a reader's stance, it made for a really fantastic reading experience. So Wicked My Love is wickedly good, in my opinion.
All right, good. So I'm glad you liked that one. So Wicked My Love. And I'm going to run through some of his other books that I think are highlights, and I'll make this somewhat fast. 1946, he wrote a book called The Pigskin Bag that was started out as a full-length novel in Mercury Mystery Magazine and was later released by Dell as a proper paperback in 1955. Main character of that book finds a heavy, locked pigskin bag, like a briefcase, in his wife's car. He asks her what's in it, and she starts acting super suspicious. People start coming at him for the bag, willing to kill for it. The whole mystery hinges on what's inside the bag and why everyone wants to get their hands on it. It was a decent book. I gotta say it was nothing special. If you're trying to read a bunch of Bruno Fischer book, it's worth reading, but it's not going to change your life or be your favorite book of the year. As opposed to 1955's We Are All Dead, which was a 50-page novella, which actually started out in Manhunt magazine. It's one of my favorite crime stories ever that anyone ever wrote. And again, Bruno Fischer's We Are All Dead. It's the story of a payroll robbery and the getaway that gets all loused up. And I don't want to give it too much away, but all hell breaks loose. The story begins with the robbery itself, and so it's a bit like a Parker novel. It's available as an ebook from Amazon for $1.50, and it's going to be the best $1.50 you spend this year. So check that out. That was my introduction to the guy, and I still haven't found anything that was as good. It's called We Are All Dead, and it's available as an ebook right now. 1960, he wrote a book called Run for Your Life. Remember the movie Trading Places?
Yes.
Right. So the similar concept where a multimillionaire named Willie, who's telling the story, gets mugged and has his clothing stolen from him. And so by a bum, and the bum left his bum clothing behind. And so Willie dresses up like a bum in Central Park, even though he's like a bazillionaire. A girl named Nina walks up to this bum, which is Willie, and solicits him to commit a burglary, thinking that he's a homeless guy. She asks him to steal a manila envelope in an apartment. He breaks into the apartment, swipes the envelope, and there's a dead body laying in the place. The whodunit, which evolved, it was sort of lame, but it became a couple on the run story where this girl Nina and Willie are kind of running from the law together and running from killers together. That was awesome. And the whole time he's not telling her that he's like this multimillionaire, and he's sort of enjoying the kick of kind of being on the run with this sexy girl. It was a really great couple on the run story. I liked it. I can't say it's a masterpiece, but I really enjoyed it. And then we talked about the last book he wrote in 1974's The Evil Days. It was published after a 14-year hiatus when Bruno was 62 years old. Caleb, the main character, his wife, finds a bag of jewels and wants to keep it to get more money for the family. Of course, keeping found jewels is a bad idea in crime fiction because there are always bad guys who want to get their hands on it. This fits nicely into the noir idea of an honest man led astray into a world of criminality by a scheming woman. The woman happens to be his very materialistic wife. It also touches on Bruno's socialist theme that material wealth only ends up bringing misery. It was a great book. It was reprinted by Starkhouse as a double along with a book called The Bleeding Scissors. I want to give some credit where credit is due for all my information about Bruno Fischer. This didn't just come off the dome. There's a book called Paperback Confidential, Crime Writers of the Paperback Era by Brian Ritt, which I used as a source. The Bruno Fischer Wikipedia entry is also extremely helpful and comprehensive. There's a website called What, When, How that was really helpful. And that's about all I got for Bruno Fischer. A lot of his books have been reprinted by the usual suspects. So if you check out Bruno Fischer on Amazon, or you can check out reviews at paperbackwarrior.com to decide where to go with him. And anyway, that's Bruno Fischer. You got a review to do. You're going to be talking about a book called Crime Commandos by Peter Cave.
Yeah, exactly. And thanks for the hard work on Bruno Fischer. I'm sure our listeners really appreciate your labor on that. It was really educational and interesting. But we'll move up things to 1976 with Peter Cave's The Crime Commandos. Peter Cave was a British guy. He was a newspaper reporter and editor before transitioning into writing full-length novels. The majority of his literary work was in the 1970s and 1980s under his own name, but he also wrote under a name of Petra Christian. He contributed to 3 installments of the New Avengers television novelizations in the late 1970s. He was fascinated by the easy rider culture. Cave wrote a handful of biker novels, beginning with 1971's Chopper. Beginning in the mid-'80s, Cave authored 5 books as tie-ins to one of the UK's longest-running television shows. It was a show called Taggart. My first experience with Cave is this 1976 team-based commando novel. It was printed by Everest. It was a British publisher, and it was run by an esteemed author named Ken Follett. You may remember his Pillars of the Earth being a bestseller. In the book's author's notes, The Crime Commandos was actually a pilot novel for an expected series of team-based combat adventures. The paperback even has the obligatory team member names and the skill sets printed on the back cover. It had all the ingredients for a series, except it didn't really have successful sales numbers. It's my guess that the debut didn't receive enough consumer demand to warrant additional installments. Nevertheless, the book is it's surprisingly a lot of fun. Paul Crane is a detective inspector working long nights in London. As the book opens, Crane arrives to a crime scene to find a slain young woman. Shortly afterwards, a constable arrives with the prime suspect. After Crane's questioning, the man admits to killing the woman after she asked him for money. In an explosive rage, Crane brutally beats the man. With plenty of witnesses, Crane is brought to his superiors where he's chastised for allowing his pending divorce, alcoholism, and depression to bring about this downward spiral of police brutality. He's then suspended from the force with orders to get his life cleaned up. After a few days, Crane is summoned to a special council with a man named Grant. The idea is to form this urban guerrilla force featuring 4 of London's most controversial law enforcement officers. Crane's given free rein to use whatever methods he chooses for targeting high-profile criminals. He'll receive weapons, supplies, targets, and support. Here's the interesting thing, though. The catch is that Crane must be publicly arrested for taking bribes and placed on trial. With some agency resources, Crane will then become owner of this notorious blackball club, one of London's seediest criminal dives. The trial will provide a light sentence, and Crane will officially be terminated from service. It's this orchestrated bit of theater that places Crane into this undercover operative role while still allowing him to mingle with other criminal cohorts at the Black Ball. Crane accepts it, and thus the crime commandos are assembled. You got a guy named Cornish, another named Lake, Babsley, Jelly. And interesting enough, Jelly is a dog. It's the first commando-based, I guess, team sort of book that I've read that has a member being a dog. But their assignment is basically tracking down this terrorist cell calling themselves Apocalypse. They blow up buildings throughout London. Then they eventually move on to kidnapping. So it reminds me a lot of this book we talked about a couple weeks ago called Terror in Turin by a guy named Robert McCarvey. It was a book from 1981, and it was a team-based commando novel. And it was very similar, where the team had to go out and stop this mad terrorist cell. And unfortunately, Robert McCarvey sucked at telling the story. It wasn't a very good book, and I'm sure it eventually ended up to be a terrible 6-book series. But Peter Cave does the same kind of thing with Crime Commandos, but he tells it extremely well. It's a winning formula. It's got engaging characters. It's got a propulsive narrative, and it's mostly got a believable villain. So I really enjoyed Crime Commandos. It's an excellent action-packed novel. I wish they would have produced more installments, and I'm hoping that our good friend, author, and publisher Lee Goldberg is going to unearth, 2 or 3 more manuscripts that just never were published, maybe 15 years from now. I'm hopeful, but we'll see what happens. But again, that was Crime Commandos by Peter Cave. Tom, do you have time for a quick review?
I don't have a review, but I got a couple shopping stories.
Fun.
I'll make it real fast. So I went to a Goodwill store, and I found what I thought was a Fargo book. It's Fargo number 4, but what do you notice? I'm handing this across to you. What do you notice about this Fargo book?
It's in Spanish?
Yeah.
It's in Spanish.
Read the title.
Los Invensores Apaches.
You clearly took Spanish in high school, right?
Es su nombre la Valencia et su... The only thing I know how to say in Spanish is voy a conseguir un traductor de habla español en un solo momento. It means hold for a moment for a Spanish translator.
All right. So anyways, yeah, I found a copy of a Spanish version of Fargo number 4. Looks probably it's probably called the Apache Invaders. It was published by a publisher called Libros Fiesta of Miami, Florida, and every single word of it's in Spanish, even the kind of ads in the back hyping other books. So I thought that was sort of an interesting oddity.
You should keep that.
I'm going to totally keep it.
Okay.
I'm not going to read it because I don't speak Spanish, but I'm going to totally keep it. This is going to be the pride of my thing. All right, I'll make it really quick. I also got 2 good deals on paperbacks from eBay. One is called The Mob Says Murder by Albert Conroy. Who's Albert Conroy?
I know that name, and in fact, I've got 2 books by that guy.
It's Marvin Albert.
Marvin Albert, okay.
Yeah, Marvin Albert is Albert Conroy. The order came straight from the top. If she gets out of line, kill her. It's a Fawcett Gold Medal. It's short in pages, but the font is like microfiche. So I will probably have to squint to make it through the 141 pages of that. But it looks good. Everything he writes is good. And I got one that I never heard of by an author named James L. Rubel called No Business for a Lady. Meet is from 1950, although this printing, I think, is from 10 years later. Meet Miss Donovan, the private eye who wears mascara. She's easily the most beautiful Seamus living. I don't think there were a whole lot of female private eyes in the 1950s.
It's the only one I know.
This might have been the first one. There was one later that had in a successful series I want to talk about called Honey West, but I think this may have been a very early one, if not the first one. It also has a way too small of a font, but I'll work my way through these. So
I hate those.
It was important to them to have a certain thickness for their books, regardless of how long the author wrote. Anyway, we're running out of time, so why don't you say goodbye to our peoples?
Goodbye to our peoples.
That's it. You can join us every day at paperbackwarrior.com for reviews and articles. Check out the archives, too. We've been doing this for a long, long time. And so if there's an author or a book, just spin it like a roulette wheel. Go to the right-hand side and just click on a month from the past and see what we had to say about a book 2 years ago. I think you might have some fun finding some great gems.
And remember, we're doing 2-a-days now, just like in football practice, 2-a-days. You got reviews at 6 a.m., and then you got another brand new review at 2 p.m.
Exactly. And if you're interested in reading reviews, click on those things because we are following what you're clicking on. And if you're not interested in reading afternoon reviews, we're going to have to figure out something to do with this giant backlog we've written. Anyway, that's it. Thank you for joining us on the Paperback Warrior podcast. Please subscribe on iTunes or whatever your favorite podcast platform is. Write a review and say nice things about us when you're at cocktail parties. That's all, folks. Bye-bye now.
Bye.